I'd like to ask past Armand Spitz lecturers in the audience to stand and be recognized. The first Spitz lecture was presented in 1967 by Mrs. Grace Spitz. It's a GLPA tradition to read part of Armand Spitz's letter to GLPA President Bondell Chamberlain that he sent when the Spitz lectureship was established. So allow me to read the letter dated April 30th, 1967. It was addressed to Mr. Bondell Chamberlain, President of the Great Lakes Planetarium Association, Abrams Planetarium, Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. Dear friend Chamberlain, I hardly need to express to you my appreciation for the letters in which you informed me of the honor the Planetarium Society is conferring upon me by instituting a series of lectures in my name, and for your other messages of encouragement since my illness began now almost 9 months ago. You may have heard me say many times that, in my opinion, the full potential of planetarium, and I use the word in its broadest possible connotation, has yet barely been scratched. It is my earnest hope that the people who are chosen to be the Armand Spitz lecturers will be selected because of the fact that they have creative imaginations in this field and the courage to visualize the achievement of ideals in a practical way by the use of the planetarium instrument. I've always dreamed of its use to help produce more and better astronomers, and I believe that is now coming to pass. Perhaps I have dreamed equally long and earnestly about its being used as a catalyst to begin reactions which will help people to understand each other individually and collectively. So please, in your selection of speakers, choose those who are not ashamed to acknowledge that they have a dream. And let the point always be stressed that we as thinking beings occupy a unique vantage point in nature between the macrocosm and the microcosm, and that we have the intellectual capability of comprehending both. My greetings to all of you at the Abrams Planetarium. It is one of my most earnest hopes that it will not be too long before I will be physically able to visit you and make your acquaintance and see for myself what you're doing. Greetings and thanks also to the members of the Planetarium Society. Good luck to all of you. Cordially, Armand Spitz. Please permit me to introduce this year's Armand Spitz lecturer. Sheldon Schaefer has been a member of the Great Lakes Planetarium Association since 1976, and a member of IPS also since 1976. Sheldon is a past president of GLPA and a two-time conference host. He retired as Director of Education and Planetarium Curator at the Peoria Riverfront Museum in February, after he got rid of all of us last year. After 38 years with the museum and its predecessor, Lakeview Museum of Arts and Sciences, and 43 years in the field. In fact, I can't remember Sheldon not being at a GLPA conference. Since 1980, he has taught introductory astronomy at Bradley University and continues to teach in retirement. He grew up in Columbus, Ohio, graduated from the Ohio State University with a Bachelor of Science in Astronomy, and after graduation, he entered the U.S. Peace Corps, serving in the Science Teachers Workshop program in India, where he married his wife of 43 years as of today. He then entered the planetarium field at the Hudson River Museum in Yonkers, New York, and completed graduate studies at Wagner College in Staten Island, New York, with a Master of Science in Science and Planetarium Education. Ladies and gentlemen, Sheldon Schaefer.
Thank you, and let me just embrace a little bit of new technology here. I've never used an iPad for something like this. And we also have to get out of this Windows. That's just a test slide to see if the clicker works. But I did get a nice send-off from the museum through the local papers. And the next time I appeared in the newspaper, See me in the back there? And the silver sneakers, geezer size class? When Gary called me, and forgive me for reading this, but I try and stay on time. And I've got 44 years to recollect here, and I think it's going to take 44 minutes. When Gary called me, I was honored and humbled to be asked to speak at what I consider the highest annual honor in GLPA. Then I panicked. Armin Spitz's legacy is huge. How could I ever measure up? Then I remembered my rules for using a star map. Hold the map the same way you're facing. Look up, because the sky is over your head. And in the memorable words of Douglas Adams in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, don't panic. So to fight off panic, I immediately opened a Word doc and started typing. And just as a million monkeys typing will eventually type the entire works of William Shakespeare, which actually has been done now, the germ of an idea emerged, leaving a legacy. Armin Spitz certainly left a substantial legacy in the planetarium field. This lectureship is part of his legacy. All of you, another part of his legacy. 3 of the 5 planetarium instruments I've had bore his name: the Spitz STP, the Spitz A3P, and the Spitz 512. And since we're talking of legacy, let me start with some family pictures. Mary Ann, my wife of 43 years, 2 daughters, Erica and Andrea, 2 sons-in-law, and 3 grandkids, Santiago, Sebastian, and Avery. But this isn't just a cheap chance to show you family pictures, although it is. There are stories about the planetarium and stories about the kids, and they're intertwined, as many of you know. Armin Spitz's legacy was an important part of my formation. His words certainly inspired me, and I want to read portions of his letter again. You may have heard me say many times that the full potential of the planetarium has yet barely been scratched. It is my earnest hope that the people who are chosen to be the Armin Spitz lecturers will be selected because of the fact that they have creative imaginations in this field and the courage to visualize the achievement of ideals in a practical way by the use of the planetarium instrument. I have always dreamed of its use to help produce more and better astronomers, and I have dreamed equally long and earnestly about its being used as a catalyst to begin reactions which will help people to understand each other. Armin Spitz treasured the capacity of the planetarian to think outside of the box and the ability to use our special environment to create inspirational, life-changing, pivotal experiences. His legacy was to inspire planetariums, myself included. Armin Spitz wasn't my only inspiration. I had invaluable mentors early on. And just getting into the planetarium field was serendipitous. I didn't start straight out of college intent on becoming a planetarian, but rather I stumbled into the field after 2 years in the Peace Corps, training in-service science teachers in South India. My first job started with the Yellow Pages for the New York City area. For you youngsters here who have no idea what a Yellow Pages is, this is a Yellow Pages condensed. For the New York City area, it was 10 times this, an old paper version of Google to catalog retailers in a region. I looked up planetariums in the Yellow Pages. So the job search then started with the Yellow Pages and ended up at the planetarium in Yonkers at the Hudson River Museum. The Anders had a Spitz STP, Space Transit Planetarium, a rare instrument. Only 11 were made, 40 years ahead of its time. It gave the visitor, back then, an opportunity to do what digital databases now finally do, and the visitor could control the planetarium in a simulated docking procedure. It was an amazing instrument at the time. The education director at the Andrus, Ken Savory, was my first supervisor, but he was much more than that. He became a mentor and a friend for the next 20 years, till he died from cancer in 1993 at the young age of 45. His legacy included 2 planetarium shows written and narrated by Carl Sagan, The Exploration of Mars, with an original score by the now famous Philip Glass, and Cosmos, the planetarium show. in Peoria. It was the most watched regular show feature in all of my years at the planetarium. After the Andrus, Carl Sagan's connections led Ken to the JPL, where he became mission planner for the Galileo mission. Another part of his legacy was my career in the planetarium field. Not only did he hire me for what was a really cool job, but his creativity and enthusiasm quickly led me to conclude that this was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I had several pivotal experiences that first year. First, Ken sent me to the Spitz Institute. There I was enthralled by the presentations by George Reed. Some of you remember George. He was the Spitz lecturer in 1984. Well, 1984, that was a few years ago. At the Spitz Institute, he demonstrated simple interactive lessons for elementary students and showed how teaching the basics using little more than the planetarium instrument can be effective and fun. Just teaching about sunrise and sunset was a total thrill for a second grader. George did it with an understanding of second grade humor and an engaging questioning technique, inviting personal observation. He was brilliant, and he showed how all the bells and whistles in the world couldn't compete with a really good live planetarium teacher. My commitment to live lessons for grade schools was part of his legacy. While at the Andrus Planetarium, I was also introduced to regional planetarium conferences. I got to go to the 1974 SEPA meeting, met Jack Horkheimer, and the 1975 MAPS meeting, and developed what has become an obsession for attending meetings every year, even without a budget. My first meeting was definitely without a budget. I brought my sleeping bag and spread out on the floor in someone's hotel room, and I learned that networking was one of the best ways to create opportunities, and I've never let up. The fact that network usually involved beer didn't hurt. Wagner College was my next stint, now as a graduate student. I was a laboratory instructor in earth sciences, and for my earth science astronomy labs, used the book Under Roof, Dome, and Sky, compiled by MAPS in 1974. There have been many resources created over the years, but I'll name just three. Under Roof, Dome, and Sky, Universe at Your Fingertips from the Astronomical Society of the Pacific, and the Planetarium Activities for Student Success Series, PASS, from the Lawrence Hall of Sciences. The visionaries who led these three projects have truly left a lasting legacy to the planetarium field. Those have been my favorite go-to resource books for all these years. Tom Hamilton ran a small Spitz A3P facility at Wagner College that was attached to the science department, and the education department had a really flexible program that allowed me to get my master's in education with a specialization in planetarium education. My thesis was a follow-up of two early studies, Joseph Chamberlain's 1962 doctoral dissertation and Dennis Gallagher's 1970 Planetariums of the World. Two more legacies in our planetarians universe. Tom recently also urged me to apply to have an asteroid named after me because he wanted to perpetuate a unique legacy, a string of astronomers who both have had asteroids named after them and have taught students who went on to have asteroids named after them, their lives spanning now over 100 years. Jacobus Kaptjan has asteroid 818 Kaptiana. He taught Jan Schlitt, asteroid 2308 Schlitt. Schlitt taught Tom, asteroid 4897 Tom Hamilton, and Tom taught me asteroid 17,601 Sheldon Schaefer. And by the way, Tom has also recently left an incredible legacy to the planetarium field, a portfolio of stocks worth six figures with which he created a nonprofit endowment that's annually generating $12,000 in scholarships for students studying to enter the planetarium field. Pam Eastlick retired from the Guam Planetarium. Tom and I are on the board. Lakeview Museum of Arts and Sciences was my first job after completing my master's. Within a year, I developed another obsession, presenting papers at conferences. It meant each year I needed to have done something that deserved to be shared. So with some trepidation, I decided to look back at all those presentations. What was successful? What was lame? And who influenced me? Recognizing that no one acts in a vacuum. Whatever each of us does is the product of our work environment, the people around us, the legacies of others, and lucky opportunities. So how well did I reflect Armin Spitz's legacy? In 1977, I wrote 2 short articles for the Planetarian about experimenting with participatory planetarium programming, and in 1978, I presented my paper at GLIPA, my first paper at GLIPA on it was my second paper at GLIPA on individual seat backlighting for participatory planetarium programming. These were all precipitated by the work of Dr. Alan Friedman, what he'd been doing at the Lawrence Hall of Science. His NSF grant led to the development of participatory show techniques and a series of workshops to share those techniques. I rarely bought into the radical idea that the public audience should be involved and engaged during the program. This was sort of countercultural at the time when public shows were evolving towards being multimedia extravaganzas. Their show, Finding Your Star, from the participatory-oriented planetarium workshops, the POP workshops, eventually led to their well-known PAST series. And that show is the foundation for what I've used for live star lectures for the last 37 years. Presentations start very simply by handing out a star map to each audience member and teaching them how to use it. As you know, Alan Friedman passed away earlier this year after a short battle with cancer. Alan Gould, in Alan's obituary, wrote, "Alan was admired and adored in the world of informal science education, both here and abroad. For 22 years, he directed the New York Hall of Science, guiding it to international prominence. He nurtured a generation of science educators who revered him. While president of IPS, he said, the uniqueness of a planetarium experience comes in no small part from the feeling of community the audience can get by all being together and sharing under the dome. That getting the audience excited is more important than cramming their brains with stuff they'll forget anyway." His greatest legacy perhaps was in the museum field, but I'll always remember him for starting the participatory planetarium movement. In 1977, Lakeview Museum decided to start a preschool and integrate multiple planetarium visits into the program. At the 1977 GLIPA meeting in Toledo, I presented my first GLIPA paper, Multi-Visit Planetarium Experiences for Preschoolers. Looking back, that paper was premature. I didn't know what I was doing until I'd attended GLIPA for many, many years. Jean Bishop has regularly presented papers on developmental learning in Piaget. I think I took a course on this in college, but I don't remember a thing from it. To this day, I credit Jean for teaching me about for education learning theory through her papers presented over all these years at GLIPA. At the 1978 IPS meeting in Washington, D.C., I prepared a paper on special effects, the only one I ever did on special effects gadgets, a neutron star, a black hole, and a quasar. I was never a gadget person, and I probably only made 3 effects in my life. I relied on engineering students at Bradley to bring special effects to life with lots of help from the Hansen Planetarium Program production guides. Special effects are definitely not part of my legacy, but rather the legacy of the Hansen Planetarium for the shows and production direction that was so important to all of us in those years, especially in small domes. In 1979, I had a really crazy idea to do a chamber concert in the dome. I got the blessing of the Peoria Symphony Orchestra's conductor, engaged the principal strings of that orchestra, found a portable harpsichord that would fit into our small staging area, and presented Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the topic of a paper at the 1979 GLIPA meeting in Minneapolis. In the decades since, live music in the dome has become commonplace, but back then there were very few resources to draw upon. The lessons I learned had to do with logistics, like how to light the music stands without getting any spill whatsoever on the dome, and that a conductorless quartet not only has to see the sheet music, they have to see each other for cueing, nearly impossible considering the light shielding on the music stands. Despite being a bit rough around the edges, being professionals, the musicians pulled it off to the raves of the audience and to my satisfaction, although not to the musicians' satisfaction. That lesson stayed with me, and 35 years later, I was able to build a dome from scratch, not just for full dome and traditional sky shows, but also designed for performances, dining, and camp-ins. I give Mitch Luhman credit for some of these features in giving me the encouragement to go forward despite their radical nature. The features included a flat floor with removable chairs that allowed one to reverse the direction of the seating 180 degrees, or remove the chairs completely and add cafe or dining tables. The 186 across the top section of the dome resulted in a 6-degree tilt to benefit both traditional star shows and full dome programming. It wasn't so low that heads would protrude into the projection area. There was a stage area in the back to give a chamber orchestra proper lighting, while allowing the optically projected stars to be seen by the audience in all their glory. We used the space for a chamber group last year, and that's what these photographs are from, and the conductor, a stereotypic, temperamental perfectionist, was amazingly satisfied with the space. It worked the way we wanted it to. In addition, the dome has been used for numerous fine dining events, receptions, and scout camp-ins. 60 kids can spread out in sleeping bags under the stars. I thought this dome design might be my legacy, but probably not. One vendor last year opined that it was just too far out of the mainstream for what customers want, so don't expect to see another one like it. But personally, I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad Mitch encouraged me to go ahead and do it that way. Just a very brief mention, in 1980 at IPS in Chicago, I presented Integrating the Planetarium and Museum Visit. As you may have noticed, Renee, my successor in Peoria, presented a paper at this conference on the very same topic. If you're in a museum, that's what you do. In 1981, the public's knowledge of science and science preparation was being questioned. Sound familiar? So I developed a 25-question inventory of basic content and sky knowledge that I've now given to my Bradley class for 33 consecutive years. That year, I presented it at GLPA in Cleveland, and in 1984, I did a follow-up article for the Planetarian. And among the revelations was that a 5th grade class, at the end of their astronomy unit, had the same score as a college student at the beginning of the semester, 56%. Through all of these years, I haven't changed the test lest I invalidate the conclusions, which, should I ever get motivated in retirement to do some formal analysis, we'll never know if I don't get that motivation. I have never analyzed the results, unfortunately. In 1982 and 83, we took GLPA, IPS, and MAPS by storm with the introduction of Soluna, our new mascot. There were 2 papers, some of you remember. There were 2 papers, the creation and use of a mascot to enhance the visibility of a planetarium, presented at IPS in Vancouver, and a new approach to the teaching of constellation figures at the GLPS MAPA meeting in Rochester. And here's Ursa Minor to greet all of you. The mascot was a flash in the pan, dependent on a serendipitous appearance of just the right volunteer. The use of stuffed animals and dolls in the teaching of constellation figures was a presentation technique I used up to the very last Project Star Walk lesson that I did the week I retired. The original idea sprang from Rita Lures, who brought Soluna to life, but her legacy, as it turned out, was not the character of Soluna. It was the use of stuffed animal constellations. In 1984, I presented a paper creating a false color density map of the Milky Way galaxy at the IPS meeting in Monterrey, Mexico. And the next year it appeared in the Planetarian and later on in the Past series. This was a watershed for 2 reasons. First, my daughter's career and direction in life were set at this meeting. And second, I developed what I think to this day is a unique interactive planetarium activity, one in which students collect real data from a planetarium using a simple collection instrument, otherwise known as a 1-power Charmin. In fact, I once did a paper for a teacher conference on 10 uses for 1-power Charmins. And then they use that data to collect the data that they collect in the dome to make a false color map of the Milky Way galaxy, a false color density map of the galaxy. 30 years later, in the 2004 meeting in GLPA, I presented a companion piece measuring stellar parallax and stellar diameter under a planetarium sky. I say a companion piece because all three activities show how the planetarium can be used to demonstrate fundamental astronomical concepts based on actual observations made in the dome from data taken in the dome. This, to me, is one of the most important things a planetarium can be used for, and I think activities like these are specifically what Armin Spitz had in mind when he wrote his letter. But now back to 1984 being a watershed. At the start of this talk, I mentioned family. From 1976 through 1999, my daughters were brought up thinking IPS and family vacation were the same thing. Since I was paying for IPS travel, I combined every meeting with a family vacation. Erica, my oldest daughter, first attended an IPS meeting in Boulder, Colorado when she was 1 year old. We loaded the old station wagon up and went to Washington, D.C. in 78, Chicago in 1980, Vancouver in 1982, and in 1984 we really splurged and flew to Monterey, followed by a week on our own in Mexico City. The Monterey Conference did something that only one other IPS meeting of the 15 I've attended has ever done. They had a family program that immersed the families in the local culture. The second meeting like that, to some extent, was Borlänge, Sweden. The children of conferees were enrolled in a special section of the host museum's week-long day camp and treated to the most incredible Mexican cultural immersion program imaginable. For lunches and dinners, spouses and children converged on the conference and met up with the conference delegates for special programs featuring cultural entertainment. Andrea, seen with the big sombrero, was at a very impressionable age of 7, and the impression of Mexico really stuck. She ended up majoring in Spanish in college, studied abroad in Mexico for a year, worked there 2 additional years, and married a Mexican gentleman from the school she was attending in Mexico. That meeting's legacy, the legacy of this entire profession, this entire gathering, is reflected in the life of my daughter. Another legacy of meetings comes from networking opportunities, meeting people, talking about what you're doing, sharing, presenting papers, and of course, hospitality suite experiences unexpectedly open the doors to opportunity. Such was the case with Project Starwalk, a curriculum project developed by Pat Olmsted from Delaware and being disseminated through the National Diffusion Network of the U.S. Department of Education. After meeting Pat at a meeting, I invited her to do a teacher training in Peoria. We implemented the curriculum in a dozen or so districts in our region, and when Pat decided to move on to other projects, she transferred the dissemination grant to Peoria, where it remained for half a dozen years, and I hired Bob Riddle, some of you may know him, as dissemination director. I did papers at GLIPA in River Grove in 85, Guppa-Rumpa, don't we have great acronyms, St. Louis in 86, and IPS Borlänge, Sweden in 1990. Ironically, even though Project Starwalk is 30 years old now, if you're looking for the perfect planetarium classroom curriculum to mate with Common Core's next generation science standards, look no further. Project Starwalk pairs with the Common Core like bread and butter. It was just 30 years ahead of its time. And whatever happened to the National Diffusion Network? I was curious. Wikipedia turned out to be a great source. The NDN from 74 to 95 was the first federally sponsored effort to identify and spread to America's schools innovative education programs, all that of which had been validated by research and then rigorously reviewed by their in-house Joint Dissemination Review Panel. What a great legacy. And then it was eliminated by the 105th Congress through a cost-cutting initiative sponsored by the new Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and the Contract with America. Now there's a legacy that I'm glad isn't mine. Maybe if I get elected to Congress, I can change that. Sometimes a good idea follows a meandering, serendipitous path to fruition. Such was the case for a parental involvement program in 5th grade astronomy, which I presented in 1986 at IPS in Tucson. In my second year at Lakeview, I was asked by the neighborhood Catholic school if we could do some special programming with them, and this resulted in what I later termed Multi-Visit Curriculum Coordinated Planetarium Visitation Series, using ideas from the Spitz Institute and Under Roof, Dome, and Sky, I worked with teachers of the school to arrange a series of live lessons tied to the school curriculum for each grade level. Typical for a school planetarium at the time, but less common for a museum facility. After the first year, I went out to other nearby schools to sell the concept. In the village of Peoria Heights, I found just the right person. The principal of that small district was very eager for innovative programs, and he connected me with the 3 schools in their small district. He was eventually to become their assistant superintendent, and a few years later, he ran for the elected position of county superintendent of schools, where he upset an entrenched political hack. I volunteered for his campaign. It was my first political campaign, and I embarrassed my kids for several months by displaying a 4-foot-long pencil-shaped car top sign on the family car for 2 months. But networking pays, and for the next 31 years, he remained county superintendent and was always a staunch ally of the museum and of the planetarium. And then back to the Heights schools. One of the teachers, Joy Stoner, just couldn't get enough astronomy in her classroom. We started with 2 planetarium visits, then went from 2 to 3 to 4, and eventually 5 visits for her 5th grade class in that school year. We got some small grants to help pay for all of this, and that even allowed us to add a parental involvement component. We had at-home activities, Saturday planetarium shows for the families matched to the classroom planetarium visits, and we culminated the unit with a star party for the students and their families. It was the ultimate in classroom planetarium integration, what every planetarian thrives on. And all this happened because the right people at the right time were ready and receptive when we came knocking. Things don't always work out, but sometimes they do. And after presenting the paper at IPS, Joy suggested submitting it to the NSTA in 1987. It won their Star Award for advancement of science education. The next 3 papers fall into a category I'll call wild and crazy ideas. In 1986, at GLPA in Cleveland, was a new approach to audience participation, getting your audience to boo at your shows. At the 1988 IPS meeting in Richmond, Virginia, Murder for Fun and Profit, a murder mystery event for your museum, and the 2009 GLPA meeting in Bay City, Michigan, Wine and Cheese Under the Stars, a new program strategy. I'd like to think that Armin Spitz would have appreciated them for thinking outside of the box. All of these were great fun. 2 had live theater, and there was alcohol involved in the conception and implementation of all. Riverboat Annie was the world's first and only astro-melodrama performed in a planetarium dome. It was a traditional melodrama featuring an astronomical plot twist presented in the planetarium, complete with live music. There was a hero who invoked cheers from the audience, a heroine greeted by sighs, and a nasty evil villain. The only thing missing was the throwing of peanuts, and which I somehow concluded might be a bad idea with a Spitz 512 exposed in the middle. The local restaurant offered dinner before the show, but we weren't quite ready to serve food in the planetarium. That would wait for 20 more years. The astro-melodrama expanded to a full museum murder mystery event, latching on to the hotel-based murder mystery craze. We turned it into a high-end event to enhance the profit, complete with formal dinner, and at the end of the evening, a dessert at which the murderer was revealed. What I didn't count on was that the writer and lead actor who was going to conduct the reveal would become indisposed before the final scene, and he hadn't told anybody who the murderer was. Luckily, actors are a resourceful bunch, and one of the other actors made up an ending on the fly. And even luckier, the audience was none the wiser. At IPS that summer in Richmond, I staged a vignette of a murder during one of the breaks, complete with a murder victim being carried out on a gurney by faux paramedics. The intent was to promote the paper to be presented later that day. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as you all know, planetarians are a helpful lot. And one of the delegates kept insisting that the victim would benefit from immediate CPR. And it was really awkward keeping him at bay. Live unscripted theater, it seems, is fraught with pitfalls. But it wasn't the end of live theater in my dome. We thrived on the live theatrical version of Where in the Universe of Carmen Sandiego, courtesy of Bill Gooch, which was our most popular planetarium show for school groups for well over a decade. We experimented with the skies over Hogwarts, and my wild and crazy period never really ended. Just as I got older, my taste became more refined. In particular, my taste in fine wines was developing, and I came to the realization that the missing ingredient in planetarium shows wasn't more special effects, it was alcohol. First wine, and later on craft beer. Turns out that it's also a good way to get a patron to pay $30 for the same show that costs $5 on a Saturday afternoon. We experimented at Lakeview, featuring local wineries, and it really took off in the new dome at the Riverfront Museum. And now that we had a space designed for cafe tables and intimate couple seating, we were ahead of our time. I don't know if you've noticed, but movie theaters are now following the same model. So next time you sit down in a planetarium show with a nice bottle of wine, think of me. That'll be my legacy. In the 1980s and 90s, in the late 80s and early 90s, I presented 6 papers focusing on outreach and collaborations. A K through 6 trailing astronomy library, a telescope loan program, planetarium programming to meet Girl Scout badge requirements, and a passive solar heating activity for the planetarium in collaboration with the local PBS affiliate. We're all what I call quickies. First, an idea, possibly a small grant, then the program comes to fruition in less than a year and a paper at the next conference. In contrast, the last of this outreach and collaboration thread was 17 years from conception to final presentation, and it had started and ended with a GLPA meeting. Conceived at the 1991 GLPA meeting in Youngstown, and finally in 2007 and 2008, I presented Outreach to Space, a collaborative model for rural community engagement. First the paper at the Triple Conjunction in Wheeling, and then brought the actual exhibits to Milwaukee. Mitch Luhman, Jerry Mansfield, who, as we already noted, very sadly passed away this past year, and I had been friends for many years. We were driving together to the Aztec meeting in Louisville, Kentucky, immediately following the GLPA meeting in Youngstown. To fight off severe butt fatigue, we brainstormed topics for our next collaborative endeavor and found a winner. 10 years later, we were ready to submit the project to NSF, went through 2 rounds of rejected applications. On the 3rd round, we finally made it, received a $2 million grant that supported the final development and 4 years of delivery. Most memorable was that we created a space-science exhibit set that would compete with the Carnival Midway. I was at the Illinois State Fair during one of our sessions, 10 days at the fair. Talk about being loyal to the project, 10 days. And I'm not making this up. Parents had to cajole their kids to leave our tent, saying such things as, come on, if we don't leave, we won't have time for the rides. And the kids literally had to be dragged away. Isn't that the kind of engagement we're all looking for? A topic I've always been fascinated in was archaeoastronomy. If vacations didn't include an IPS meeting, there was likely an eclipse or archaeoastronomic site involved. I've been to Stonehenge, Avebury, Callanish, and Newgrange in the British Isles, Woodhenge, Chaco Canyon, and other Anasazi sites in the American Southwest, and Monte Alban and Teotihuacan in Mexico. In 2008, I went to Newgrange in Ireland. This was following my daughter Erica's wedding in Northern Ireland. There's that family connection again. And while there, entered a lottery, along with 35,000 others, for a chance to be in the sacred chamber at Newgrange and witness the winter solstice sunrise. Much to my surprise, in 2009, I got a registered letter from County Meath, Ireland, notifying me that I was one of 50 winners. I went, and I actually saw the shaft of light climb up the passage. I didn't do a paper on that. or any of my other archaeoastronomic experiences but one. In 1989 in Champaign, I presented recent changes at the Sundagger site on Fajada Butte Chaco Culture National Historic Park. We had gotten the grant from the Illinois Humanities Council to do a show looking at archaeologic evidence of climate change and how it affected the Mississippian culture at Cahokia, Illinois site of Wedgehenge, and the Anasazi culture of Chaco Canyon, where there were numerous sites with astronomical alignments. What I really wanted was a chance to see the three-slab site on Fajada Butte. So I wrote a research proposal to the National Park Service that gave me and Georgia Neff permission to go up Fajada Butte with a park guide to photograph the Anasazi Sundagger. And by the way, I can't talk about those who have influenced me without mentioning Georgia, my right-hand partner in crime at Lakeview Museum for 25 years. That's her in the large sun hat. Unfortunately, not the best shot of her. The project in Chaco Canyon was another demonstration of her dedication to the planetarium and doing things right. After we got back to Peoria, she found that she didn't have the right camera shots. So she packed up and just ran back to Chaco Canyon and did photography all over again. The Sundagger appears at noon as the solstice approaches for about a week on either side of the summer solstice. And here it is, the last set of photographs ever taken of the Sundagger. As later that year, the rocks slipped from erosion, and it never worked again, and seemingly dropped off everybody's radar. Honest, we didn't touch it. It really worked when we left, and I was so glad we had a park ranger with us as witness to our innocence. Another potential legacy eroded away. But for what it's worth, this show introduced climate change as a planetarium topic 25 years ago. As Planetarium started the move into video in 1991 at the Youngstown meeting, I presented a paper titled Uninventing Codolith on the use of a presentation program, Harvard Graphics 1.1, the predecessor to PowerPoint. What I wrote was so prophetic as to be almost comical. I wrote, in recent years, numerous papers have been presented describing new and increasingly sophisticated techniques for utilizing Codolith and other high-contrast copy films in planetarium shows. What was once the medium for titles has become the medium for dozens of illustrative techniques. With the advent of video projection and computer interfaces into planetarium programming, high-contrast copy films may become a medium of the past. The first use of Codolith, planetarium titles, can now be done much more easily on a computer terminal and projected onto the planetarium dome. When I went back and read this, I was so proud. I had predicted the demise of Codolith. Of course, more than half of you out there probably don't have a clue what I'm talking about. Codolith, what's that? From cutting-edge prophecy to no one cares anymore. We also experimented with the use of black-screened puppets as live characters in a planetarium show. This was before green screen was common and possible in the days of high-contrast CRT projectors without any additional technology. We started the show with scrolling video credits done by a professor at the local university. A Starry Tale, the outcome, was presented at both GLPA in Dayton in '93 and IPS in Cocoa Beach in '94. The goals stated in the paper were also prophetic and comical. To eliminate the use of dedicated special effects projectors, to eliminate the use of Codolith, and to eliminate the use of still slides, especially talking still artwork. My legacy might have been as an innovator in the development of video production for the planetarium, but at IPS, where I showed portions of the video, including the scrolling credits, which I had not done at GLPA because GLPA wasn't prepared in those days to show video, I discovered that the producer of the credit scroll had misspelled planetarium. We'd been using it for months, and no one in our audience, nobody on staff had ever noticed, but it was sure noticed at IPS. And I was more than a little bit embarrassed, how fleeting fame can be. At least, according to Google, besides running for public office, what gets the most hits is being curator of Peoria's community solar system. Plural, because who else has gotten the chance to build the solar system twice? The first time in 1992 and the second time last year following our move of the sun to the Riverfront Museum. All of this stemmed from my first job in Yonkers, part of Ken Savory's legacy, where I first did my scaling activities, and I kept after them ever since. Between 1987 and 2006, I had 7 papers and articles relating to the solar system model, our activities, and events using the model, and other scaling activities. There were 4 things about this long project which excited me. First was the chance to be interviewed on NPR's All Things Considered by Lynn Neary. Second was a relationship that developed with Barrow Public Schools, culminating with a week-long trip in the winter to the Barrow, doing outreach in all of the schools in the city. My 6-year run in the Guinness Book of Records, especially the 95 edition, which had an expanded article about our project, and articles that ran in Discover Magazine and a show on Discovery Channel that was even seen by my cousin in Scotland. Perhaps as a warning that just because you can doesn't mean you should, the story I want to tell, though, is about our greatest programming failure using the model. The interplanetary motorcycle ride and poker run. We sponsored the interplanetary bicycle ride for 15 years, and the interplanetary 5K is still going. The interplanetary motorcycle ride, however, started dismally, and 2 years later mercifully died. In a 1995 paper, I first alluded to the possibility, writing that during the Peoria Motorcycle Club's Grand National Motorcycle Championship races, 30,000 motorcyclists converge on Peoria. My plan was to attract several hundred from this diverse group, lead them on the 200-mile grand tour of the solar system. Our liaison with the group, however, suggested a poker run, a common motorcyclist activity combining gambling and riding from bar to bar getting cards for a poker hand. They didn't think the motorcyclists would participate if there were just planets. I took the advice to have poker cards at the planets, but ignored the need for beer. Mercifully, only 16 participated the first year, and by the third year, this had dwindled to 4. I know all of us constantly try to engage new, non-traditional audiences. A lesson here? Sometimes it just isn't meant to be. Gambling road games are not part of my legacy. Maybe I should have included the beer. The overarching message here is a huge part of your legacy is the ideas you share with the field. And it's all intertwined. Your legacy is the composite of all that you make it and those who have influenced you, past and present. You just have to make it happen. Even if you're busy, do something each year that pushes the envelope, and when GLPA IPS or whatever conference time comes around, think about what you've done that year and what no one else has done, and share it with a paper, poster, or workshop. Fertilize the field with new ideas. And if you can't get to as many conferences as you like, host one. It was just such fun hosting in 1982, I had to do it again last year. And of course, I couldn't consider my legacy without mentioning Renee, who has succeeded me at the planetarium curator at the Peoria Riverfront Museum. Renee was one of my students at Bradley and admits that I had some effect on her following this weird path that's led her into the dome. However, she's not just part of my legacy, but the legacy of my mentors. Ken Savory and George Reed, Tom Hamilton, all of the MAPS contributors to Under Roof, Dome, and Sky, Alan Friedman and the contributors to the past series, the contributors to Universe at Your Fingertips, and all of you here at GLPA, who have been my family and inspiration through my 44 years in science education, 42 in the planetarium. In the broadest sense, we all have a special legacy, the perpetuation of civilization. We are all connected through the sacred information that we impart. We are purveyors of the most incredible story, the story of the universe, its beginnings, how we, our star, and our planet came to be, our physical connection to the stars and the wonders of the night sky. Throughout history, those civilizations that studied the stars, whose members mused upon our beginnings and who understood the cycles of the sun thrived. They knew how to derive a calendar rooted in the stars, and knowledge of a calendar is the hallmark of a civilization. Without an appreciation of the wonder of the universe, without the ability to keep a calendar, civilizations wither and die. Someday, through our own inattention to the environment, through some horrific collision with a space object, or through our innate distrust of those different from us, our modern technological civilization may collapse. And if and when that happens, the perpetuation of this civilization will depend on all of us. That will be our collective legacy. In the words of Armin Spitz in the closing of his letter, and let the point always be stressed that we as thinking beings occupy a unique vantage point in nature between the macrocosm and the microcosm, and that we have the intellectual capability of comprehending both. I thank you.
To present to you. It's presented to Sheldon Schaefer, 2014 Armand N. Spitz Memorial Lecture. In recognition of your dedicated service and contributions to the planetarian profession and science education, given with grateful appreciation by the Great Lakes Planetarian Association here in Muncie, Indiana, October 31st, 2014. We are pleased to have you.
Networking to be done.